All right, so in this video we are going to cover, in what ways we can analyze GDP. Once we've defined it, we know what we're talking about, and once we've measured it, according to either our income or expenditures approach, we're going to have some data, and so we want to begin to think about, what that data is going to tell us. So for any given period of time, either a month or a year, the first thing we look at is just, the total market value of all the things we produced. And so for the United States, if we look at GDP for a given year, maybe, recent years, maybe 17, 18 trillion dollars worth of goods and services. Okay, so it sounds like a big number, but what does it tell us? Well, really on the surface, all it tells us is that we produced a lot of stuff, basically, right? So what it becomes more interesting when we look at just GDP for 1 year is to not just look at our country, but to look at other countries as well. And so every country, has its own economy, and will have, if we measured everything in dollars, every country will have its own market value of goods and services. And so what we can do is we can compare the size of countries' economies, and then just start to think about, how is that going to affect the relationships between these countries? So, for example, the largest economy in the world is the United States. Okay, so we produce the most goods and services. Pretty close, depending on how you measure and define GDP, is a country like China. All right, so we are two very large economies, and if you think of an economy like a party, well, you can think of the United States and China as throwing the biggest parties on the planet, and you might think that, okay, well, whoever's got the biggest party, they're probably going to have a lot of people that want to come and participate in their party, right? Everybody likes big fun parties. Now, that's not to say there's anything wrong with other countries that have smaller economies or smaller parties, right? It's just a different type of party, right? And so, if we think of it as people wanting to join other people's parties, well, you've got the biggest party. You have a lot of people that want to party with you. What if there's someone that you don't like, right? Or what if there's someone that talked bad about you or did something you didn't like? Well, you can simply say, you can't come to my party. And so if we think about it in terms of the economy, right, a country like the U.S., if our society, if our government has disagreements with other countries, then we may be able to, flex our economic muscle and say, hey, until you, change your policies or do something differently, we are not going to let you have access to all of our markets in our economy, right? You can't sell your goods and services to us, and you can't buy goods and services from our markets. And so when we look at overall GDP, we begin to get a sense of not just the economic power of any one country, but also the political power, because you can use that economic carrot to try and encourage other countries to do the things that you want them to do. Now, another thing we can do in terms of just 1 year at a time is, rather than look at just total GDP, we can look at GDP per capita. So per capita meaning just per person. And so what we do is we simply take GDP and we just divide it by the total population. So let's go back to the example of United States and China. Both countries have really large economies. But China has a population that's about 4 times the size of the United States. And so when you plug the numbers into the equation, so GDP divided by population, you'll see that in a place like the United States, GDP per capita is about, $50,000, give or take, right? So if you take all of the economic activity and you distributed it or sliced it up evenly, every person in the United States would be earning or enjoying about $50,000 worth of stuff. Okay, if the economy were a pizza, right, we'd be giving everybody an equal slice of the pie. Now in China, they also, again, have a large economy, but with 4 times as many people, that means they've got to slice that pizza up into smaller and smaller slices. And so in economic terms, in monetary terms, a country like China has GDP per capita of, somewhere around $10,000 or $12,000, in any given year. So obviously, even though China has a really large economy, its GDP per capita is much smaller because of the larger population. And so if you wanted to live in either of these two countries and you were looking at GDP per capita, you would look at a country like the United States with an GDP per capita of $50,000 and China with $10,000 to $12,000, and you would say that, I probably would want to live in the United States, because we use GDP per capita as a measure of the standard of living. So people on average enjoy higher standard of living in the United States than they do in China. Now, we could look at other countries and see how they compare to the United States and China. So you may take very small countries in Europe like Switzerland or Liechtenstein. And these countries have, compared to the United States, tiny, tiny little economies, right? And you might think, well, so what? They have a tiny economy, we'll just ignore them. Maybe we don't need to really trade with them because they're not producing that much stuff. But in terms of GDP per capita, in terms of standard of living, when you account for the fact that even though they have a relatively small economy, they also have very small populations, you see that they have a very high standard of living, a very high GDP per capita. So some of these small European countries, tiny compared to the United States, both in GDP and population, have GDP per capita of $60, $70, $80,000, right? And so we would, take that as a sign that there's a higher standard of living in those countries. Now, GDP and GDP per capita, we can consider that kind of static analysis, right? We take a snapshot in time and we look at GDP per capita for 1 year for a given country, and then we can make some comparisons. Now, where things start to get more interesting is when we track that GDP or GDP per capita over time. And so what this is going to allow us to do is to examine and study further those two major topics of macroeconomics, both the short run and the long run. So in the short run, we want to see what's happening to GDP as it goes through periods of expansion and contraction. What happens when times are good? What happens when when things are bad? And so we see GDP from month to month and year to year, both rising and falling. And so this back and forth, this ups and downs, is what we refer to as the business cycle, the short-run economic fluctuations. And so once we've got the data and we've mapped it out, we start to identify different phases of the business cycle. And every cycle has 4 phases. And so let's imagine that we start off in a period of expansion, where year after year our economy is growing. Okay, that's our first phase. Now, eventually, the economy is going to start to slow down, and it's going to kind of hit a maximum point, and we call that a peak. So in any narrow window of time, you find the highest level of GDP, and you would say that GDP has reached a peak at that particular moment. Now, of course, what goes up must go down. And so after you've peaked, it's downhill from there. And so we would say that the economy has entered a period of contraction where GDP is declining, where we're producing fewer goods and services from one time period to the next. Now, eventually, it's going to continue to decline, and eventually it's going to kind of slow down, and then it'll kind of bottom out. And so within that narrow period of time, we identify the month or the year in which GDP hits its lowest point, its minimum, and we refer to that as the trough. And then, of course, once you bottom out, it's back uphill from there, and we go back into a period of expansion, and we repeat the cycle. So expansion, peak, contraction, trough. And we typically measure one economic cycle from the peak to the peak, or from the trough to the trough. Right? So if you pick 2 peaks or 2 troughs, you'll see that the economy goes through all 4 phases of the business cycle. And so then what we want to start doing is start measuring the periods of expansion and the periods of contraction. We want to know how long do these phases last? How long does our economy grow? How long are we in a contraction? All right, so we measure it in terms of time, duration, but we also measure it in just the absolute change or the relative change in the GDP. So if our economy is growing, at what rate is it growing? Is it growing at 1%, 2%? China for a long time had growth of like 8, 9, 10%. So we measure, how far up GDP rises in its cycle, and we also are going to measure the depth of the contraction. So if our economy is shrinking, and we're producing fewer goods and services, how much or how much fewer? And so we might see, an economic contraction of, about 0.5% or 1.5%. So we can start to make much more accurate measurements of what's going on with the economy, both in terms of time, duration of expansion, contraction, and also depth. Now, when it comes to contractions in particular, we recognize that sometimes contractions are not necessarily such a bad thing, or at the very least, it's nothing to be too concerned about. And a great example is every winter in the United States, we know that there's going to be bad weather. Right? There's going to be lots of, there's going to be more snow and ice and rain. And when people, get stuck in bad weather, they get stuck at home and they can't make it to work, which means they're not being productive. And so when the winter is particularly bad, we may actually see economic activity slow down so much that for a month or two we actually go into contraction where GDP is declining. Now, in those cases, it may not be so much cause for concern because, again, when as soon as winter's over, everything starts thawing out. People start getting back to work. They start getting caught up, and the GDP, the economy gets moving again, and so GDP starts to rise. So in those cases, when a contraction lasts for a relatively short amount of time, we may not worry so much, especially if we expect it to be happening due to things like weather. Now, in other cases, the contraction may last for a longer period of time. So we may have a bad winter, and it contracts for 1 month and then 2 months, and then it continues to contract into a third and a fourth month, so we start to pay a little bit more attention. And finally, when it hits the fifth and then the sixth month, after 6 months of contraction, or 2 consecutive quarters, right, so 2 3-month periods, this is when we officially declare that we are in a recession. Okay? And a recession is just another word for a contraction. Why do we choose 6 months? Why isn't it 4 months or 8 months? Well, that's just the way we define a recession currently. And so there's an organization called the National Bureau of Economic Research. This is made up of economists from all over the place. So some are university professors, some are economists that crunch the numbers for the government, some are economists that work for private corporations. And they are, kind of keeping their finger on the pulse of the economy. They're tracking the data. And once they've seen 6 months, 2 quarters of economic contraction, they blow the whistle, they throw the flag and say, okay, folks, we are in a recession. And then the question is, well, how much longer is the recession going to last, in terms of duration, and how much deeper into a contraction or recession are we going to fall as a result? Now, in particular, we can look at 2 periods of severe contraction, just to give us some historical perspective. So obviously the biggest contraction that the United States has faced was the Great Depression. And so in terms of duration, we identified the peak to the trough, right, the high point to the low point, as lasting from August of 1929 all the way up through March of 1933. So 3.5 years of contraction. Now recall from history class that in October of 1929 is when the stock market crashed, and that's typically the point that we refer to as the beginning of the Great Depression. But in terms of the data, we actually see that the economy had started to contract just a couple of months before the stock market crash. But then, of course, it was all downhill from there. So we've got 3.5 years, 3 years and 7 months of pretty consistent decline in GDP. And by the time we finally reached that trough, by the time the economy hit rock bottom, we had lost about 27% of our GDP. So we were producing 27% less in terms of goods and services. So pretty steep. The other thing to note about the Great Depression is that if the economy is producing less, that means firms don't need as many resources. In particular, they don't need to hire as many workers, and so unemployment is going to rise during a contraction as a result. And in the depths of the Great Depression, at least nationwide, we saw unemployment hitting around 25%. Now, in some cases it wasn't so bad, but in other cases it would hit 40 or 50%, just depending on what was going on in that area. Now, President Hoover, he was in the White House when the Great Recession, or the Great Depression, excuse me, started, and he doesn't get a whole lot of credit for a lot of stuff. But to his credit, he at least was able to recognize and say, hey, things are bad, and so he turns to his economic advisors and says, hey guys, tell me how bad it is. And unfortunately, no one at the time really knew how to measure this thing that today we call the economy. And so this is really where we start measuring these aggregate data, such as national output and national unemployment and the overall price level. And so this is when we start to be able to form this idea of the economy, and then start to measure it so that we can see just how bad things really were. Now, we've had many recessions since then, nowhere near as long or as bad as the Great Depression. And that was true up until back in 2007, 2008, 2009, when we experienced what today we call the Great Recession. So the Great Recession, we date it from December of 2007, so that's when the economy peaked. So you may recall that up through 2007 there was a lot of trouble in the housing market. We hit that peak in 2007, and then we experienced contraction all the way through 2008 up until June 2009. So a solid year and a half, or 18 months of contraction. And by the time we hit rock bottom, again, we want to know, well, how much did GDP shrink? And we lost about 4.3% of GDP. So by no means as bad as it was in the Great Depression, but 4.3% was the most significant hit to GDP since the Great Depression. Other depressions had been much smaller and lasted a shorter period of time. And then, of course, we might want to know, well, what happened to unemployment during this most recent recession? And again, because GDP didn't shrink as much, we wouldn't expect that unemployment would rise as much. And officially, our unemployment rate hit 10%. And of course, in some parts of the country it was higher, some parts of the country it was lower. So that concludes this lecture on analyzing GDP. So for a given period of time, we want to know total GDP, GDP per capita to tell us something about the standard of living, and then we can begin to track GDP over time and follow it through its business cycle. And in the next lecture, we will use this idea of tracking GDP over time to address our second major topic of macroeconomics, which is long-run growth.